And it's not that the government has granted us these rights, it's that these rights were pre-existing and that the government can't infringe on those rights. And I think a lot of people, continuously miss that. They think, well, government giveth, government can taketh. But the reality is that government didn't giveth. The government is prevented from, infringing on these existing rights.
What is up, everybody? Really excited about today's podcast. I'm joined by Adam Kraut, Executive Director of the Second Amendment Foundation. Pretty big deal, the Second Amendment, Adam. And like I said, I am pumped to be talking about this. A lot going on these days. Maybe there's a lot going on all the time that I'm unaware of, and maybe I'm just more aware of things right now. But it seems like there's an absolute barrage of activity and things that, in my opinion, are threatening the Second Amendment. And actually, I printed something off so I wouldn't say it wrong. But before we get started here, I wanted to read the Second Amendment and just have that in the back of folks' minds, as we chat through some of these topics today and the Second Amendment Foundation. So here it is, the Second Amendment, as I have printed it off from the interweb. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It seems pretty straightforward to me, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, it's been the subject of a lot of controversy, though.
So before we, like I said, I wanted to preface everything with that there. But before we get too deep in the weeds here, man, if you can, introduce yourself, give us a brief, bio, background, how you ended up at the Second Amendment Foundation.
First, thank you for having me on the podcast, Mark. Very much appreciate it. I've told my story a number of times over the last couple of years as I started to, become more involved in the industry and the space. But it all started back in, it was the early 2000s, I want to say, maybe late 90s, down at Scout Camp in Camp Horseshoe in Rising Sun, Maryland. It was the first time I ever shot a gun. It was a 22 Marlin with peep sights, and I can remember just having this stupid smile plastered to my face after my time on the range there. And that was really my first experience with firearms. And from there, following summer, I think I bought tickets to the shotgun portion, and I can just remember being terrified of the kick on this shotgun. It's going to be awful. And I psyched myself up so much that when it was my turn, I got up there and I just yelled pull, and I immediately pulled the trigger. And the guy who was running the range said, "Hey, you got to aim." And it was at that point I realized, I'd got in my own head about how bad this was going to be. And, mind you, I'm like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old kid at this time. So, and so from there, it was just kind of, that was where my, experience or first taste of all this really came from. And I turned 18. I bought a shotgun. I was told to get rid of it when my parents discovered I had bought one. Still have that shotgun, so that didn't pan out.
Good.
I turned 21 and I went and got a handgun and a concealed carry permit. My parents discovered that and told me that, I'd more or less be, my lifespan would be temporally limited. I'm still alive and kicking, fortunately. And as you can probably guess from this, I didn't grow up in a house that, guns were a thing. My parents, I would say at that time, were definitely trending, if not anti-gun. And that was the world in which I lived. So as I got older, I went to college, I came back, I took a year off, and I ended up going to law school. I figured it was a good way to put off being an adult for a couple of years. So I went as a night student. Turns out, joke's on me, not a good way to put off being an adult. And it wasn't until my last year in law school where I was coming to the realization that I'm going to have to enter the workforce, and I have no practical experience to sell myself in this profession. So I went looking for an internship, and I had seen on this Pennsylvania gun form this one attorney's name consistently listed over the years I'd been on there. So I looked him up. Turns out he was only about an hour away. I sent an email saying, "Hey, law student, love guns, looking for a job, internship. You got anything for me? And oh, by the way, I don't think I actually want to practice law, which was a really good salesman, apparently. And so, I got an email back from his dad, who was the owner of the firm, basically telling me, hey, never tell anybody that again if you're looking for an internship, and sorry, we don't have anything for you. So I emailed back and said, no, you don't understand. I'm looking for an internship. And after a few more conversations, I was actually able to come to some terms where I ended up with an internship at that law firm. And that's where I practiced law for 5 years after I graduated law school and passed the bar exam. And during that time, I guess it's important to return real quick back to my parents. I don't want to leave the audience hanging with, oh, your family's totally anti-gun. During that whole time period, at one point, my dad kind of randomly one day asked me to take him shooting. And so I did. And that stupid grin that was plastered on my face when I was a kid down at scout camp was on his face. And over the years, it hasn't been an overnight process, but over the years, his thinking about guns has evolved significantly from where it was back when I was a kid. He owns guns now. He has a carry permit. He understands the importance of the right. And I think a lot of where his understanding of everything had come from was from what he had learned through, the media, from reading news, and what he was exposed to through, television shows and movies and things like that. Why would anybody need one of these things? And giving somebody a practical experience and kind of things to think about so that they can examine and form an opinion based on reality, I think led to that evolution in my parents' thinking, particularly my dad. So anyway, returning back to my story now, so I worked there for 5 years at the law firm. My entire practice revolved around firearms related stuff. It was a lot of individual things as far as advising people whether they're prohibited, doing gun trusts, industry representation, ATF compliance. I had worked at a gun shop for a couple of years, so I had experience behind the counter, managing the store, dealing with the realities of what it's like running a shop and compliance. It's easy to say this is what the law requires. It's very different when you have to deal with the realities of running a business and dealing with people and what they need, and all while trying to maintain compliance so that the ATF doesn't just walk through the front door and shut you down for failing to comply with any number of the regulations they have. So after, about 5 years of private practice, I was offered an opportunity to go to another nonprofit where I started as the director of legal strategy. I left last summer as the vice president of programs. And when I left, I made a few phone calls to let very few people know that I had, decided to move on with my life and career. And that's when Alan called me. And Alan, for those that don't know, is the executive vice president and the founder of the Second Amendment Foundation. And he and I had some discussions, which ultimately culminated in me joining the organization as the executive director. And this is where the future is headed with the organization. So that's kind of the real quick down and dirty version of the history. Man,
I love it. And you answered one of my questions. I was going to ask if you were able to, turn your parents and actually, it's like, oh, turn but really just educate them, enlighten them. I see behind you, there's a little banner that says "Think or Die," and man, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like, let's think about these things, right? And I also find it super interesting. You do come as far as being involved with firearms and preserving the Second Amendment. A very unique background of coming from a family who wasn't, a gun family or familiar with firearms. And like you said, potentially even probably leaning more towards anti. And I get that because what you do see often, from the media, from other places, why wouldn't it, if you're not familiar with firearms, if they're not, you don't grow up with them, if you don't view them as something, a tool to be respected, right? That is going to be, I think, your perception. Like, where else would you have garnered any other, ideas or thoughts than from those places that are kind of, I guess feeding those thoughts. So it's definitely unique, I feel, for you to have taken the path that you have without having that background. I know for me, I grew up in Western Washington, but I grew up in like a hunting and a gun family, right? So that was like natural for me to, I guess take that path and have maybe a different understanding than a lot of the other people that I was surrounded by at school or otherwise. So, good on you for, I guess, finding that. That's definitely very interesting to me.
Yeah, I had growing up, there was one friend I had that came from a family that hunted. They did archery, but also shotgun. In the wildlife management unit that we live in, because it's so populated, you can only use shotguns in this area. But I can remember, especially during senior year, he would, take off to go hunting. But he was, out of all of the friends I had growing up, I think he was the only one that I know came from a hunting family or family that did that and that owned guns. I have a hard time thinking about any other families that or kids that had guns in their homes when I was growing up. And it wasn't really a thing around here, or it wasn't widely discussed anyway. And I think, to your point, the practical experience of dealing with firearms or having a positive encounter with firearms, I think in my experience throughout life of introducing people to firearms has certainly shifted perceptions. At worst, you get somebody who's still kind of sitting on the fence and isn't sure about it. But I would say 9 times out of 10, if not almost 10 times out of 10, they usually leave there smiling, thinking that, okay, everything I've been told isn't necessarily true. And that, there are utility in these, things, be it self-defense, be it hunting, be it just having a good time at the range. And I think as gun owners, in trying to shift, people's perception and this culture issue or culture war that we're certainly dealing with, that one of the best things you can do is take somebody shooting, show them a good time, and be safe about it. Don't be the person that, hands their girlfriend a 44 mag revolver for the first time and laugh. You see that stuff on YouTube and things like that, but you're not doing anybody any favors doing crap like that. But if you can give somebody a positive experience where they walk away feeling that, okay, everything I've been told about this big scary thing is not actually true, and it's not scary, it's actually fun, and there is utility in it, you just now have shifted somebody else's perception on it, and hopefully that they'll go out and start their own pathway, into the gun world and perhaps become a gun owner. And if not, at the very least, hold an opinion that isn't, we need to ban these things because of the acts of a few mad people.
For sure. I think that's a excellent point, and we talk about it, and people preach it. And I think oftentimes, and I include myself in this, I talk about it more than I actually do it. But yes, if a person is open to having that experience, I think there's a high likelihood, number one, like you said, they're going to have a good time. And if there's several people there, they're going to look around and they're going to say, wait a minute, all these other people are having a good time, or I do see the utility of this. These are, good people. These are people that I would actually likely hang out with, and maybe we're a lot more alike than I thought we were. And again, I think it goes back to, I'll go back to that banner in the back of the room, just think, be open-minded and think about things. And I think that goes for everybody, right? I think we should all at least be open to considering what another person has to say, because they are coming from a place of, their perspective, their experiences. At the end of the day, you might not agree, right? Oftentimes we don't, but I think oftentimes we can. So, and I think, like you said, education and experiences is a big part of that.
Yeah, I think, the one thing that stands out that I think is just worth mentioning is, you get, clearly this is a controversial issue. I don't think it should be, but it is a controversial issue. And when you're looking at the controversy surrounding it, a lot of times you're dealing with people that are talking about the issue in terms of feelings and not from a place of logic and reason. and I've said this repeatedly, but I think it bears repeating again and again and again. When you have opposing views that are not speaking in the same language, you have emotion versus logic and reason. It doesn't, the argument you present, even if it's solidly grounded in logic and reason, you have all the factual evidence to back up your position. You're never going to get around somebody saying, well, I feel scared, I feel unsafe. The best you can do is try to empathize with why they feel that way and say, but look, that feeling's unfounded. Here's why, and lead them to the place of logic and reason. Otherwise, you're just going to be shouting at one another, and everybody's going to be pissed off because you're just never going to communicate with one another on the same playing field. So I think that's important to consider, and for people to just kind of keep in the back of their mind that when you're talking about things from a factual perspective and somebody's responding with an emotional response to it, you're not going to get anywhere with just that conversation. You need to find a way to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and I think that's where people who are pro Second Amendment, can get frustrated at times, because you're like, I've presented all the evidence, like all these things make sense. And like you said, it is like you're speaking a different language because that person is arguing from a completely different place and really a completely different language. It's like you are shouting at each other in a completely different language, like you said, and you're not getting anywhere. That's an interesting way to look at it. Do you find where you've been able to present facts to a person that's coming from a place of like, well, I feel, and in some ways, like, I can respect that. Like, they're not wrong. They do feel that way. Like, they are having those feelings like, oh, the guns are scary, I feel unsafe. And so they're not wrong, but like you said, it's unfounded. And have you been able to overcome that in instances by presenting facts?
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to give you an example off the top of my head, but there have been instances where you just have to navigate dealing with somebody's feelings. I understand that you're scared for whatever reason, but look, here's the reality of the situation, right? Assault weapons. I know we're going to talk about the assault weapons ban and other things that I'm sure are going to come up through the course of this conversation. But I was doing an interview last week about our lawsuit in Washington, and one of the questions that came up was, the news anchor went through and listed, any number of recent tragedies and gave me quite a laundry list, and said, these are horrible tragedies, and certainly was playing on the emotional aspect of that. And there's no question that, the loss of life is tragic, and nobody I've ever met in this community has ever said, oh, we don't care about the loss of life. I think everybody does care about it. However, we do have a constitution. The Constitution spells out rights, and you can't just eviscerate the rights of everybody because of the acts of a few mad people. And my point to the anchor was that if you look at it from a statistical perspective, and it's, again, we're trying to take something that's very emotional and trying to put it into a box of logic and reason. Statistically speaking, the number of deaths that are caused by these so-called assault weapons is statistically insignificant. You have FBI crime stats over a 5-year period showing that there were more murders committed by hands and feet and like blunt instruments than there were by rifles, period, let alone the subset that you're calling assault weapons. And so, whether or not that actually resonated with them, I don't know. I think they were all pretty, dead set in an agenda. But it's things like that where you can try to bridge that gap and shift somebody's thinking of, okay, I'm scared, or this is my emotional reaction to, okay, well, when you put it that way, like if you're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to be shot by somebody who's engaged in some kind of, insane act, are you just never going to go outside because there's a chance you might get struck by lightning? Or should we all walk around with lightning rods? At what point do you go from okay, the proposed solution is so radical that it just doesn't make any sense, and that we can't go down this road of just stripping everything away from everyone because of a few people. Like we don't do that with any number of other things. Speech, I hate using cars as an example, right? But like, we don't get rid of cars because people drink and drive, things like that. So yeah, I would say, to answer your question, there have been instances in the past. I'd be hard pressed to pull an example off the top of my head, though.
Yeah, I mean, but you bring up a lot of, interesting things there. Like you said, like you're not going to ban cars because some people use them irresponsibly. People, some people text and drive, right? And there's incidents there. It's like we didn't ban cell phones because of that. They're part of our daily life. They're very useful, and if used incorrectly, could result in the loss of life. So, yeah, it just, like you said, the logic doesn't necessarily line up, and I think also the result, and maybe you can talk about this, but even when something is instituted, like I'm sure we'll keep talking about, and there's a lot of things we talk about, but the recent developments in Washington, or similar things that have happened other places, it doesn't really result like in what was theoretically trying to be accomplished.
So laws serve two purposes. They either serve to deter certain behavior or to punish behavior after it's happened. That's it. And I mean, it's a very basic premise, right? And the people who are going to do whatever it is they're going to do don't care what law you pass. So the only thing you have is the punishment aspect on the back end, because the deterrence factor isn't doing anything for them. Again, it's a silly example in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's a very valid example. Murder is illegal, right? People still do it. The laws, when you look at them, and particularly now, I think post Bruin, you're seeing a lot of governments just trying to implement whatever it is they can. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I think part of it is we'll just let the courts sort it out. And two, they don't have anything to lose. They can pass whatever they want. They're not personally liable for it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's our dollars as taxpayers that are being used to defend lawsuits that we also, as individuals who care about this issue, donate to organizations in order to be able to fund them to bring those lawsuits. So in a lot of ways, we're almost we're fighting against ourselves in some aspects. So yeah, I mean, I guess to go back to that, laws are they exist and they serve to either deter or punish at the end of the day. And if you have somebody who doesn't care about the deterrence aspect and might not even be particularly concerned about what the punishment is, then unfortunately it's not going to stop that person.
Right. And like you touched on earlier, these incidents, which are incredibly tragic, and I think, any reasonable human being would agree with that, but they are outlier incidents. Like when you consider, the grand scheme of, everything that goes on in the world, how many guns there are in the world, how many gun owners there are in the world, the incident is not minor, but to the scale at which, I'm not, and I think, as I'm sitting here not being able to articulate my thoughts, I don't think I'm the only one that's like that in the same breath. Like maybe myself right now is a good example of like I've got all these thoughts and I know I'm coming from a place of reason and logic, but sometimes it's hard to articulate those things to a person who, might have an opposing view.
It's also hard sometimes to frame it in a context where you don't sound cold-hearted and uncaring and just not unhuman, if you will, right? Like it's, and I think that's part of the problem. It's very easy to, again, going back to the emotional aspect, it's very easy to tug on emotional heartstrings on this issue in a lot of ways. And then a lot of the response, it's in some ways hard to get that same emotional reaction. And a lot of times, it does sound kind of cold and callous. Well, statistically, it's insignificant. Well, I'm sure for that person and, the people that are around them, it's not statistically insignificant, and nor would I suggest as much. But if you're looking at it again from just a very broad based logic and reason, statistics do mean something, right? It would be like, I don't know, certain kind of illness, right? You're unlikely to get it, or statistically, only a small percentage, like less than 1% of people who get it are, going to die from it or have some awful thing. When we look at it, that everybody just shrugs their shoulders and says, "Oh, okay, right." I guess having trouble articulating my point there, but I think you see where I'm going with it.
No, I do. And I think, at the end of the day, we're talking about laws here, right? Like ultimately, we're talking about the Second Amendment and, as it relates to, gun laws, legislation, things that are getting, proposed, pushed through, passed. And I guess in my opinion, and you have a lot more knowledge of this, but like to me, like the law, like it is pretty black and white, right? Like it is, and it should be based in fact, not how you feel. I might feel because somebody stepped on my toe that they should go to the jail for the rest of their life because I was, just really offended by that. Well, no, right? Like, yeah, I think so. When we're considering laws and how these things transpire, like I think we have to, not to take any away from individuals who have been affected by a negative incident that involved a firearm. Like you can't, but also like we have to look at these laws logically and kind of from more of that black and white perspective.
Well, you got to remember, we live in a country with a constitution that does outline certain rights that we as people have. And it's not that the government has granted us these rights, it's that these rights were pre-existing, and that the government can't infringe on those rights. And I think a lot of people, continuously miss that. They think, well, government giveth, government can taketh. But the reality is that government didn't giveth. The government is prevented from, infringing on these existing rights. So I think as long as laws are, implemented in a manner that comports with what the Constitution requires, that's one thing. But when it goes beyond that, which is what we're seeing particularly in this area, that creates all kinds of problems and leads to exactly, what our purpose is.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, as in my opinion, the Second Amendment is continually really getting chipped away at, right? But when your reality is your reality, right? So if I'm a person, I was born today, I'm going to grow up in a culture where, well, this is the law, right? Like, and that's how it always has been for me, right? And so like as that, I guess time continuum moves forward and it's like chip, all of a sudden it's always been this way for, that, generation of people, but that's not how it always was, nor that's how, in my opinion, how it should be either. Like I can think of a lot of things that I've grown up regarding gun laws and things as like, well, that's just normal. That's how it is. But it wasn't always like that.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there to unpack, I think. So the first is the Supreme Court has said that constitutional rights are to be understood as to the time period in which they were adopted. So the understanding of that right is at the time period in which it was adopted. In the Second Amendment's case, it's 1791. There's an ongoing debate currently in the courts as to whether or not it's 1791 or if it's, post Reconstruction after the 14th Amendment was adopted in the 1860s. But all signs from what I've seen, what I've read, point to 1791 as the understanding, because it's a federal right. It has nothing to do with what states may or may not have adopted. Second thing being that people are born in a certain time period, and that that's their world. We see it today. To use technology as an example, right? You have kids growing up today that don't know a world without Google. Right? They never had to go to the library and use the Dewey Decimal System to go find the encyclopedia to go find the thing about the thing that they wanted to learn about. You didn't have that, and I think you could say the same for a lot of just the constitutional rights generally, not even just the Second Amendment. But I think the further in time we get away from the adoption of whatever the right is, and the less that the generationally the understanding of why it was adopted is passed down, you end up with the same kind of effect, right? Well, this is the way it's always been, but also a complete lack of understanding as to why it was there in the first place. So the further in time we get away from fighting a war against a tyrant who wanted to tax us to death and implement all kinds of awful policies on a colony, and everything that came along with it, the less of an understanding people have as to why that right exists. You see it all the time if you go on social media. Oh, well, they meant muskets and flintlock pistols, and oh, well, the reason for that amendment is no longer valid today, and all these other things, and it's completely untrue, right? I think that the reason today is just as good as it was back then, and on top of that, the flintlock and the musket were like pretty much top of the line. Granted, there were other arms that were in existence at the time. I'm not trying to say that there weren't, but people had access to quote unquote military grade hardware. If you could afford it, you could buy it. So a lot of ways, nothing has really changed except time. And I think that's important to continue to educate people as to the basis for why these rights exist, particularly, in this context, the Second Amendment, because as we get further away in time, the less there is of an understanding of that, and the more likelihood there is for people to shrug their shoulders and say, who cares? Like, we don't need that anymore. Or, that's, we have different feelings about it now.
Right. And I think that same person might think very differently if a situation arose where they might need that. You might be like, oh, now, I can see why we probably needed that at this point. And I don't think, anybody wants to be in the situation where they find out that, the Second Amendment was a good idea.
Well, you could just ask the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, right? The Warsaw Ghetto uprising during World War II. There was a small resistance that, for what it was able to accomplish something. But could you imagine if those people were in that position and actually had the arms necessary to, put up a protracted fight? I bet they aren't wishing that, they weren't wishing that, oh man, I wish we just gotten rid of guns sooner. No, I expect the exact opposite. So there are very valid reasons for the Second Amendment. There are very valid reasons for protecting that right. And the other thing that I think a lot of people like to harp on, you had read the Second Amendment at the beginning of this podcast. And a lot of people get hung up on the militia clause there. The Supreme Court's gone through this already back in Heller. The Second Amendment, there is an individual right to keep and bear arms that's totally unconnected to militia service. It was a pre-existing right. It's an individual right. That individual right to armed self-defense can be traced back throughout history. And it's nothing new. It's not a new concept. So, to the extent that people are saying, well, it's, a militia thing and only the militia should have it. Well, you're wrong. And this is an individual right, and we'll continue to fight for everybody's rights on that front. Something that I believe in.
For sure. And I've heard people make that argument that you mentioned before, like, well, yeah, we didn't have AR-15s, back then, and it's like, no, we didn't. But the Second Amendment is, remains the same and steadfast, and just moves along as technology moves along. The government didn't have AR-15s back then. Nobody did. I don't think it really it doesn't hold water when you're saying, well, the masses should be relinquished to pitchforks, unless those get taken away. These folks, get these types of firearms to use, potentially how they see fit, which could be any number of ways. A lot that potentially could be negative.
And the Supreme Court again has weighed in on this, and it's really timely because there was somebody on Twitter that was arguing about they meant muskets and flintlock pistols, but somebody had posted a quote from the Heller case, and it says that some have made the argument bordering on the frivolous that only arms in existence in the 18th century are protected by the Second Amendment. We do not interpret constitutional rights that way. And that's beyond just the Second Amendment. I mean, we don't interpret First Amendment rights to technologies that only existed, at the time of the founding. We don't interpret your Fourth Amendment right from, protection from unlawful search and seizure to only extend to, manners in which may have existed back then. You had a Supreme Court case in the early 2000s dealing with thermal imaging being used to look at a house that was suspected of growing marijuana, and the Supreme Court said that no good there. That was an unlawful search. So that's just not how we interpret constitutional rights, is by what existed at the time it was adopted. That would be silly. Yeah. No. Yeah. 100%.
Well, one thing that I wanted to tackle in this discussion is kind of a Second Amendment state of the union. Like I mentioned in the open, and maybe it's just like increased awareness on my part, but it just seems like as of late, there's been just a barrage of things going on in multiple states simultaneously. Like I equate it to I come from a hunting background, so I like nature and animals, but they've got that term like predator swamping, right? Where like all the does drop their fawns at the same time, and the bears and the coyotes they can only tackle take so many of them, and a lot make it, which I guess in that instance like it works and it's a good thing, but if you're trying to preserve the integrity of the Second Amendment and there's 500 things going on at once, there's a lot of work to do.
There's no shortage of work to do. Currently the Second Amendment Foundation has just shy of 50 active cases throughout the country. I think when I looked, I want to say there were challenges in, 17 states. I believe California had the most of those challenges. And I think it was in, trying to think of how many circuits we were in. It was, there was quite a few. I'll see if I can find that while we're chatting here, but there's no shortage of, things that, we're currently working on. Cool. I actually found my notes from this, so I can actually tell you. We were in 8 of the 13 federal circuits in 14 different states. And at the time I wrote this document, which would have been the end of March. So this numbers have shifted a little bit because I think there's at least one more case. California now has 17 active cases. We now have 17 active cases in just California alone. So there's no shortage of things to do. We have 8 assault weapons ban cases, with the Washington lawsuit we filed last week being the most recent. I believe there's 5 or 6 magazine ban capacity lawsuits that we have going on as well. We have a number of lawsuits dealing with young adults, 18 to 20-year-olds. So either their ability to bear arms or be able to purchase arms, both handguns and long guns, because a lot of states have implemented laws that have banned 18 to 20-year-olds from buying certain semi-automatic rifles. We have a bunch of cases challenging so-called sensitive places. So after you had Bruin decided, and I guess this would be a quick segue here to get to that, Heller, you have you had the Supreme Court say that there is an individual right to keep arms. It's untethered to militia service. They also did talk about bear, but really Heller was, about keeping arms in the home. A couple of years later, you get Catano, which dealt with stun guns. It was a per curiam opinion, and just said essentially that didn't have to exist at the time of the founding to be protected. Backing up a second, you had McDonald 2 years after Heller, which incorporated the Second Amendment against the states. That was a SAF case, by the way. I can't believe I forgot to mention that, so my apologies there. And then most recently, you had Bruin, which talked about in detail bearing arms and also the tests that should be applied to Second Amendment cases. And so what you had after Bruin was a lot of these states going, okay, well, if the Supreme Court's saying there's a right to bear arms in public, they also said sensitive places are off limits. So we'll just make everything a sensitive place. And that's more or less what they had tried to do. So we have a number of lawsuits dealing with that exact issue. I think there's 2 in New York, 1 in New Jersey. There's 1 in Illinois. There's another in California. But that's a very big one right now, is how can we restrict people's mechanisms of carry? And so we'll continue to see that being flushed out, both just locations as to where and also, permitting fees, timing, stuff like that. And then, of course, we have ATF cases dealing with the ATF regulations. So you had frame or receiver rule and also the pistol brace final rule that was published, which at the end of this month is the end of the so-called, I guess, amnesty, if you will, for registering things without having to pay the tax or disassemble or destroy.
Yeah, that's a few. That's a few.
And that's not all of them. That's just the bigger issues that are consistent from a few more than one place.
And so what does your guys' process look like? You're talking about lawsuits, and these are lawsuits that you guys are filing against the states, correct? Or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's it depends actually. Some of the obviously the ATF ones deal with the federal government, so those would be against the ATF, the Attorney General. I'd have to look at who the other defendants are because I can't remember off the top of my head. Generally speaking, though, a lot of those other lawsuits, you're suing the state attorney general and perhaps the head of the state police or whoever's responsible for enforcing the law. So that could be several people, and that's how those go. There's a couple lawsuits that are against local municipalities, so it'd be the same kind of thing. Like who in the local municipality is responsible for implementing and enforcing the law. So sometimes there's been governors, named. Sometimes there's mayors. Sometimes there's chief of police. Sometimes there's the state attorney general, things like that. So it's just going to depend as to what the issue is and where it is as to who the defendants are.
Gotcha. So, you mentioned, the pistol brace component of what's going on right now. So, where did that start, and then where is that right now? Then.
Sure. So I forget. I think it was the end of January when ATF published their final rule, and you'll have to forgive me. I don't remember. I checked this morning actually to see, and I think I saw that there were 7 active cases against this final rule. And out of those 7, 5 of them were in the Fifth Circuit, because I think that's where people have decided is a favorable place to file Second Amendment related lawsuits. The Second Amendment Foundation has a lawsuit against that final rule. Actually, we were the first to file a lawsuit back in 2021 when ATF had promulgated that point system. And they basically said, this is how we're going to address things going forward. And we sued them saying, well, hold on, you didn't even go into rulemaking. You're just now making things up. So we sued them back in 2021 over that. After that lawsuit got filed, we more or less agreed to stay all the action in it because ATF said, well, we're actually going to work on a final rule, and it didn't make sense to litigate an issue that would just become moot anyway. So after they went through the rulemaking process, which is what this final rule was the result of, we amended our lawsuit. We have a preliminary injunction that's currently outstanding. So we're waiting for a decision on that. And the way it was timed would be so that, if we don't get one, we would still in theory have time to appeal to the Fifth Circuit and hopefully get some kind of ruling one way or the other from them prior to the 31st of this month. So our lawsuit's ongoing. There's no lawsuit that I had seen that's so far gotten any kind of injunction. I saw there's only one that had a decision where it was denied. That one's up on appeal. And I think the others are all either waiting for decisions or do not ask for a preliminary injunction.
Gotcha. Now, the one thing that's, I guess, curious to me with the pistol braces is at one time, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was like, these things are good to go, no worries. A lot of people purchased them. I feel like I saw, I think it was a stat presented to me somewhere where it was like, they estimated that between 4 and 40 million people had pistol braces, which I feel like that's a pretty large margin of potential error there. But and then and I guess I'm kind of regurgitating things that I hear or that I'm aware, but then it becomes an issue of like, well, this is like a common use item that now was once okay, but now you're saying it's not okay. Like what's going on? What goes on there as far as like the logic and potential ultimate outcomes?
Fair question. So yes, ATF in the beginning said that these things are in fact fine, that it doesn't alter the firearm. It doesn't change it from a pistol to a rifle and subsequently a short barrel rifle. I mean, you go back and you look at the original determination letter that Alex Bosco had requested. And for those that don't know, Alex is the owner of SB Tactical. He's the inventor of the stabilizing brace. You go back and this was 2014, because this all started happening right around the time I actually started practicing law. And going back to my law career for 1 second here, part of what I had to do was write blog articles for the law firm's blog, and this was going on right around that time. And my boss was too busy to write about it, so I ended up writing extensively about the brace issue. And what I saw was that ATF had said that these things were fine. And if you look at the definitions that Congress had promulgated, it had always been my position when I was writing things that, if you bought a firearm that had one of these attached and you subsequently shouldered it, wasn't a rifle. If you built a firearm with one of these and you intended to shoulder it, by definition, you built a rifle because you designed and intended for it to be fired from the shoulder. It doesn't matter what the thing on the end of it's called or not called. But in doing this, what ATF has done is really just kind of gone beyond logic and reason. They've made millions of Americans, somewhere between 4 and 40 million, according to your numbers, overnights, potential felons. Many of these people are going to have no idea that this is even happening, right? Like, this isn't talked about in the evening news to the extent people still watch that stuff. It's not widely publicized. The best you get is if you pay attention to, media covering this, or the fact that it was published in the Federal Register. And, technically anything published in the Federal Register is notice for the entire country. But how many of you go and read the Federal Register every day to see what's in there? I know I don't.
I don't even know where to find it, Adam. where do they keep this register?
Well, it's online. So you could go to the federalregister.gov. But my point being is that you're not going to have any idea. Most people are not going to have any idea that this is in fact happening. So our lawsuit challenges this on several different grounds. One being, violations of the Administrative Procedures Act, and that generally is where a lot of these lawsuits come from. If you look at the bump stock litigation, for instance, you would see people claiming that this is protected by the Second Amendment. But if you look at every single one of the lawsuits filed against ATF regarding bump stocks, not one made a Second Amendment claim. Not one of them. They were all related to the Administrative Procedures Act. Or a takings claim or something like that. And that's where this is coming from too, right? I don't think that anybody's arguing that, braces are in fact arms and thus protected by the Second Amendment. I could be wrong. I haven't read all the lawsuits, but I do think what a lot of them are arguing is that, ATF has clearly overstepped its statutory authority by reinterpreting things that Congress never intended. And also, ATF has once again reversed a long held position based on what a political actor wants them to come to the conclusion of. And that's a problem, right? Like the ATF is a part of the executive branch. We have a system of government that's separated into three different branches. You have the executive being the presidency and all the administrative agencies underneath that have been delegated powers by Congress, which is designed to make the law. And then you have the courts, which interpret the law and figure out whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional, and round we go, right? So when you have an administrative agency that's now taking over Congress's prerogative to make law, that's problematic and not constitutional. So we'll see where these lawsuits go. I genuinely don't know, where this will end up. I don't make it a habit to predict what the result of lawsuits will be. It's not good for anybody.
No, for sure. So the way I'm understanding this, to some degree, is the ATF is like making a law, but the ATF doesn't make laws. Is that correct then? Or that's not within their power to do that?
Yeah. So I mean, ATF in this instance has interpreted the law in a manner that I don't think is consistent with what Congress has done, as far as clearly defining what a term is, and ATF is coming to a different result on that. So again, it deals with a lot of procedural things. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and I consider myself more, as a gun owner, more than average as far as keeping up on things as they relate to the Second Amendment and laws. I'm still and actually this is with effort, still probably uninformed, still confused. And like you said, I can see a huge constituent of people, law-abiding citizens, who potentially would be quotation mark breaking the law, unknowingly breaking the law just by having something in their house that they purchased during a time period when it was completely fine, when it was within the confines of the law, and unbeknownst to them, now they're a criminal.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, but that's the result of government and agencies being politicized to reach a predestined outcome. It's no different than the bump stocks, for instance. To go back for a moment, you have President Trump saying, I will ban these, right? There's no question he told ATF to get to this result. ATF got to the result. Now the way in which they got there wasn't correct, and there's been, I believe, 2 court decisions now that have said as much. But it just, this is what I want. Figure out how to get there, and like I said before, it's our tax dollars defending it, and it's us putting money in the till to go fight against what our tax dollars are defending against.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So where with the bump stock issue, where does that stand right now? Then, like you said, some courts have, said as such, said, yeah, no, that's not the way this is going to work. But so can you get those again now? Or can you not get them? Are they in some sort of, limbo?
I don't think you're going to see anybody going back into producing them anytime soon, if ever. But the Fifth Circuit, there was an injunction in the Cargill case. And I believe, Mr. Cargill, I'd be lying to you if I told you I knew off the top of my head whether it extended to the entire Fifth Circuit or just the named plaintiffs. There was another injunction or opinion that came out of the Sixth Circuit the other day, I think last week or maybe the week before. That was only one individual involved in that case. And then yesterday, in actually the first bump stock lawsuit in the country that I had filed back when I was still in private practice, there was an opinion released from the District of Columbia Circuit, so the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia District Court, where they denied rehearing the case en banc. So I expect you'll probably see a cert petition up to the Supreme Court out of that case, and whether they, agree to hear it or not, I don't know. It's, who knows? I know I haven't read the cert petition, so I don't want to dive too deep into it, but I do know the Supreme Court just accepted a case that deals with Chevron deference. And now that was a theory that was waived by the government in all the bump stock litigation, but Chevron generally has allowed administrative agencies to have a great deal of latitude in their actions. So if the court closes that avenue for them, that should make things very interesting when it comes to regulatory agencies and what they can and can't do in the future. But I haven't read it, so I don't want to expound on something I haven't read up on. For sure.
Another one that I hear about, fairly regularly is like, the 80%, lowers and things like that. Where was that? I guess similarly, at least in my mind, to, the pistol braces, it's like something where, yep, you can do this. And then now it's like, well, pump the brakes. Maybe you can't do this anymore.
Yeah, so that one I think is potentially a little more clear cut than the braces. So Congress defined what a firearm was, right? You can go to the Gun Control Act and you can look up the definition of a firearm, and there is a definition. And it also defined what a frame or a receiver was. ATF in this, among several other changes, they redefined what a firearm was, particularly what constituted a frame or receiver. And when you look at Congress's definition was a completed frame or receiver, which was a firearm, not an incomplete one, which is now the case per ATF, or a parts, a kit where you could manufacture one. That was not what Congress said. So there were a couple cases challenging that. Again, SAF filed a motion to intervene with Defense Distributed in a case that was existing in Texas. Filed for a preliminary injunction. The court granted the preliminary injunction as to Defense Distributed, but not SAF. It did cover Defense Distributed's customers as well. So, but the court essentially said SAF didn't meet all of the elements required for the injunction, but Defense Distributed did. That was actually appealed on Monday up to the Fifth Circuit by the government. So we'll see where that one goes. I don't think that's going to be any kind of expedited stuff. But right now there is an injunction in place. Same with Polymer 80. They also had brought a lawsuit on their own, and they received a preliminary injunction as to them and their customers, which is why you're seeing Polymer 80, kits for sale again that are the colloquial 80% kits versus the 79% kits or whatever they started marketing after that rule went into effect before that injunction was in place. So those cases are proceeding. We'll see where they go, but those seem to be a little more clear cut just based on strictly like what the definitions say. And ATF, in looking at the determination letters over the years, ATF essentially had this position, and it depended upon what the object was, but at what point enough machining was done to it where they deemed it to be a firearm. So if you looked at 80% receivers or unfinished receivers for AR-15s, there was a point in the manufacturing process where they said like, okay, this is just a hunk of metal. Anybody can buy it. And this, you need to go to a licensed dealer in order to transfer. And, they had things like if you had made indicator markings for where the trigger or the hammer pin would be drilled out, that was a bridge too far. Even if it was just, a little circle so that you just knew where to put the drill. That was too far in the manufacturing process. But if it didn't have that, good to go. And those determinations were fairly consistent throughout time from the letters I had looked at over the years. But I think, now again, we need to arrive at this result of get rid of these things. So figure out how to do that from a manner that is legalese, if you will. And that's what they did. So they redefined terms that Congress and only Congress has the power to define.
Gotcha. God, it like I've got basically like an expert explaining this stuff to me, and it's still like quite confusing.
I'm hardly an expert, and an expert's just a person that knows one more thing than you do.
Well, it's a more than one, Adam. Magazine restrictions. That just seems like a constant battle since, forever, which in some ways, like, I don't know why, one number just, it's like we pick these arbitrary numbers of what's okay and what's not okay. And what's going on there? I mean, you see, states adopting different regulations as far as magazine restrictions, but is there a win to be had there?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is a win to be had there. You have several courts in opinions saying that magazines are arms, and all of those cases were prior to Bruin, as far as the decisions that were coming out of courts. So they were employing the now defunct two-step test, where essentially courts would weigh the government's interest and say, like, okay, it's a legitimate interest, and this is reasonably, cabined within the means for them to do it, because we're applying intermediate scrutiny, which is in the layers of scrutiny, the middle one. The Supreme Court said the lowest one, rational basis, was out, and they almost never applied strict scrutiny, which was a really high bar for the government's interest to survive. And under that theory, they were able to balance away people's rights under this governmental interest. Now, with Bruin clarifying the test they should have been doing from the very beginning, that's the text of the Second Amendment, as informed by this nation's history and tradition, which requires that if the conduct is protected by the Second Amendment, it's the government's burden to demonstrate that there was a law, either the same kind of law or an analogous law that you can import reasonably into this modern day restriction to show that, look, this at the time of the founding, this would have been understood to be an okay restriction. And they're not going to be able to do that with magazine capacity. I haven't seen any laws that from the time of the founding that would have allowed them to do that. So I think the magazine, capacity restrictions are going to be ones that are going to be on the chopping blocks real soon. I think that, when we talk about the Supreme Court in cases it's going to hear, Second Amendment jurisprudence is relatively new, right? You had Miller in the 30s, which, the defendant had died and nobody even showed up for him. So you get a terrible decision, right? And then the Supreme Court doesn't touch the Second Amendment again until Heller in 2008. It was the first major case. There's a couple other cases that talk about it, but Heller's really the one squarely in a lot of people's minds. I think this is where the world begins. This is all I've ever known, right? Like this is this is the world in which we live. So relative to other areas of constitutional law, particularly First Amendment, Second Amendment jurisprudence is relatively new in a lot of ways. And so you have, going back to, again, Heller, you have individual right to keep. Does talk about bear, but everybody apparently ignored that. You get McDonald that says, okay, this is incorporated against the state's Catano, modern day arms are covered. Bruin, you get public carry, more clearly defined. So the question that I think most people have is, well, what would the Supreme Court take next? And I think if you were asking me to predict, and I don't like doing this, logically looking at that kind of progression, I think there's really two places it could go. Another issue dealing with carry, any number of issues dealing with carry, or they go to the types of arms, specifically that these types of arms are covered. Again, this is talked about in Heller, right? Common arms in use for lawful purposes, right? So there's no question that magazines that hold more than 10 rounds are commonly owned. There's no question that so-called assault weapons are commonly possessed. It's a numbers game, and you're looking at what the nation as a whole does, not just what this one small area or one state has done. Because of course, if you ban it, you've now shrunk the margin there. And if you did that 20 years ago, of course, like it's not going to be common there because attrition and all those other things. So I would think that those are likely potential candidates for another Supreme Court case if the court has an appetite to hear that. But I think what they're going to do is probably see what a lot of the circuit courts do and let them go through the process again of, okay, you guys make decisions. And then when there's a split, do we need to come in and kind of, solve it and level the playing field once again? So magazine capacity restrictions, I think, are going to be ones that are very unlikely to survive if a court is faithful to the test that needs to be applied.
Gotcha. Well, that sounds positive. And I probably should have asked this question earlier because it kind of maybe leads to a lot of the things that we're talking about. But like, is there almost like a playbook that, anti-gun groups or that, that's something that comes to mind, but where and how are these things like popping up to where all of a sudden you guys have a battle, or maybe we all as gun owners have a battle that we need to fight? Like where are these coming from? How are they getting so far? Like what's going on there?
So I think there's a couple things. The side or groups of people that want to restrict our rights, they're incredibly well funded. They have billionaires backing them, raising money for them. They definitely are operating on the same playbook. There's no question in my mind that they're actively working together with one another to figure out what the next move is or should be and how to implement it. Because if you look at the messaging coming out of all of them, it's very similar or exactly the same. You have groups like Everytown that offer free legal services to municipalities to defend their laws. So they'll even draft model language or language for bills to be introduced and to try to be passed. And then they offer free legal representation in some instances to defend those laws. So the cities don't even have to expend their resources to do it. They're getting, like, if you want to call it quality legal counsel, you're not having the city solicitor doing it. You're having somebody who is handling this exact issue across the country, day in and day out, defending that kind of stuff. So there definitely is a coordinated effort, both in terms of messaging and in terms of, what kind of laws should be passed and the defense of those laws that's coming out of all of those groups. On top of that, I think, you look at the makeup of legislatures, you have really one of two ways, I think. You have one that's either very clearly blue or red, and it's going to pass whatever it's going to pass. Like there's no question in California, if an anti-gun bill is introduced, there's like a 99% chance it's getting passed and signed into law. But if something that's good for gun rights is introduced, it's going nowhere. And likewise, in some other states, if there's an anti-gun law that's introduced, it's going nowhere. And if there's a pro-gun, let's say all these permitless carry laws that are being introduced and passed, that those are likely going to pass. And then you have ones that are perhaps a little bit more of a closer call, and a few votes swayed from one side or the other may make the difference between a law being passed or not. So I think the makeup of the legislature and or who's in the governor's office, could determine the outcome for some of these states. And that's just, kind of the current paradigm we live in. So right now, I think the fight is definitely in the courts, and the more, good court decisions we have, the less likely legislatures will be inclined to pass bad law, or alternatively, if they do pass bad law, it'll be a lot easier to just sue them and win without having to go through a protracted legal battle.
Gotcha. Next question, and this is one that I guess sits close to my heart. Being I'm a Washington native, grew up, born and raised there, and they've had, as of late, and I think you could probably expound on it a lot better than I can, but to me, some pretty radical legislation go through. What happened? Like, what happened there? And it seems like my perception of what did happen was under the guise of a quotation mark assault weapons ban, but was, I guess, a lot more far-reaching than that. And then I guess also another thing that might dovetail into is just the term assault weapon, because I feel like it's an interesting term that really, like, I mean, this is a 2-pound jug of water that I'm holding here in my Nalgene bottle. Like, this could be an assault bottle of water if I hit you over the head with it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a firearm. It might look different, it might, but I look at an AR-15 that functions basically on the same premise as one of my first deer rifles, the Browning BAR, right? So anyway, I think I want to get there, but let's tackle, like I said, just because it's recent, it's current, it's basically happening, at press time within just the last few days. Like, what happened in Washington? And it seemed like it happened pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, so not a Washington native, actually live on the opposite coast, but the organization is based in Bellevue, Washington. So, in addition to caring about the issue more broadly, it's very near and dear to our hearts, with the organization's heart, because that's where it's based out of, where a lot of people who work for it are in fact from. And yeah, I mean, my understanding was it was introduced and it did pass rather quickly. There was at one point where the House would not ratify the Senate's amendments, and that apparently caused some consternation politically. The governor was none too happy with the House and basically told them, get this signed. I don't care how you do it. And next week it was handed to him and he gleefully signed it. And he signed it, and about 5 minutes later we filed a lawsuit against them. So we were ready to go on that one. I think it was the first lawsuit filed against the assault weapons ban there, and there's at least 2 others that I'm aware of, potentially a third as well. So the ban is far-reaching. It does also involve parts, which is something that a lot of other ones did not include. Most of the time when you see an assault weapons ban, you see, named firearms, like the Colt AR-15 or, any number of things like that. And then you have a semi-automatic rifle that's capable of accepting a detachable magazine and at least one of these other features. And the features are, like a pistol grip or a collapsible stock or a flash hider or a bayonet lug or a grenade launcher, or something like just totally asinine that doesn't change the fact that it's a semi-automatic firearm firing a cartridge, of which there are any number of other semi-automatic firearms that fire the same exact cartridge. And they're claiming that this is somehow going to reduce, whatever it is, crime or deaths, or that these guns fire, cartridges so powerful. But they're not dealing with, if that's the rationale for it, you would think like, okay, well, we would just ban this kind of ammo but that's not what's going on here. So, the Washington ban, again, it's a little more far-reaching because it deals with parts. So my understanding is that dealers have just stopped selling parts, parts kits and anything like that would be construed in that nature. And it's certainly gone one step beyond just the physical firearm itself. So that's one that, again, we filed a lawsuit. We're going to be, I feel comfortable expressing that there will be a preliminary injunction forthcoming on that very shortly. I don't know when this will air, so it might already be filed by the time that this actually goes live. But that's one, again, we're gonna fight tooth and nail for Washingtonians and more broadly everybody.
Yeah. Golly, yeah. That was just Oh, there's just so much going on there. My next question is, like, I guess as it pertains to all this stuff, and maybe it loops back to, just reading the Second Amendment itself. All the things that we talked about today, or many of them, they seem like infringements to me. Like, it seems like a lot of infringing going on. So how can we look at, or how does the Second Amendment get looked at, and then things go through, like, what just happened in Washington? Like, how is that not, like, at the end of the day they go, wait a minute, no, that's infringing?
There's one of two things. They either believe what they're doing comports with what the Second Amendment says, and they truly do believe that, or they just don't care, and it's a means to an end. I don't think there's any other explanation for it. I think you see in a lot of the press releases and things like that. Well, what we've done, we believe, complies with what the Second Amendment allows for. Now, whether that's just verbiage for media consumption so that people go, oh, they considered it okay, or whether they truly believe it, I don't know the answer to that. I suspect there's some that do truly believe it, and then I suspect there's plenty of others that just don't care at the end of the day. And again, as I said earlier, they're not personally liable for any of this. So there's no skin off their back by passing a law that ultimately is deemed unconstitutional, whether it's malicious in nature or not. Whether they thought, okay, maybe this is, from their perception, they're trying to do something that they believe is good and that they believe is constitutional in the manner in which they try to implement it, versus just straight out malice of not caring and wanting to restrict people's rights. But like, at the end of the day, they're not being held personally liable for it.
Gotcha. Final question. What can people do? Because I know, like, I see all the stuff going on, and sometimes I'll there's a clickable link that takes you to, like, a place where you can at least provide comment. But overall, like, I see, I guess I'll speak from my personal perspective, like, and I consider myself, like I said, like, probably more involved than maybe the average person, but still feeling like helpless at the same time. You're like, you see these things happening and you're just like, I want to do something about it. I don't know what to do, where I can do it, what might have a real impact. Like, I've provided comment. I provided comment on the Washington stuff. Like, I don't live there, but I provided a comment. Now, I don't even know if my comment is valid or holds any sort of weight because I'm out of state either. So that's a question that I have as well. Like, can you, as a person who cares about this issue as a whole, can I, have an impact on states outside of where I live?
Yeah, so I think, generally speaking, legislatures, they only care about their constituency to the extent that they actually do care about, the constituency's opinions, right? At the end of the day, their job, in addition to, like, passing laws or what have you, is they owe a duty and responsibility to their constituents. And if you're not in their voting block, they don't need to give any credence or care as to what you think, because they don't owe you any kind of duty. And at the end of the day, you're not going to be the one reelecting them to office or being the reason that they're not reelected, potentially anyway. So I would say I wouldn't put a whole lot of time into trying to sway the opinion of somebody that doesn't represent you. And I think the exception to that would be committee members. If you're talking about committees, there, I think, there is some value in contacting people who sit on the committees where bills are being heard and things of that nature. But more broadly speaking, as far as how you can get involved, there's any number of ways. I think one of the best ways is, educating people on the issue yourself. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this podcast. I think that is one of the best ways you can do it. Because if you can sway somebody's opinion on a one-to-one basis, maybe ultimately at the end of the day, it changes the way they think, and maybe that changes the way they vote. It also might make them, an ambassador or somebody that's willing to go and share their experience with someone else and continue that culture shift to, hey, these are not bad things like you may have been told. These actually are tools that serve very valuable purposes in addition to being constitutionally protected. As I said, I think right now where this fight's happening is in the court system, and that requires money. There's, I'm not going to, not here to grovel and ask people for money, but donations are really what allow organizations like the Second Amendment Foundation to do this. And, litigation is not an inexpensive endeavor. By the time it's all said and done, I think McDonald costs close to, at discounted rates, close to $400,000 all the way through the Supreme Court stuff. And that was like really leveraging discounted rates. I mean, it's not uncommon for Supreme Court cases to be over $1 million by the time the case has gotten there. So that all costs money. And so certainly, donations to a group that you support, I would love for people to support the Second Amendment Foundation. Clearly, I very much believe in it. I work here, and I'm hoping to be here for as long as I have value and continue to push the organization forward in new into a next evolution of it. It's next year it'll be 50 years old. It's the oldest nonprofit dealing with this issue. It was founded before ILA was. So we've been at this quite a long time. We've been involved in over 250 cases in some form or fashion since our founding. So like the legal system is our bread and butter. Other than that, I mean, I think the best thing people can do is just get out there and tell the world that, hey, guns are not these evil things. Do everything they can to help change their neighbor's mind. And I think, about the last place you're going to do it is screaming about it on the internet. I think it requires that personal connection with somebody, that one-on-one interaction where, there is that human element versus just screaming into the digital abyss.
A lot of really good advice there, and definitely, some stuff that I'm going to take to the bank. And like I said, it requires, which is, a limited resource that everybody has, but, taking the time and making that effort to do those grassroots types things, but have, probably the greatest impact and the largest ripple effect. So, man, tons of good stuff there, Adam. I sincerely appreciate you talking through all of this with me. I'm going to have to personally re-listen to the podcast and try and absorb even more of it because, when it comes to the law, I don't know if it showed, but I am not a lawyer. And so just hearing how some of these things work, and I probably actually should have asked a few more questions. I might even have to, go through and define some of the terminology that you mentioned throughout. And it even sparked in me a little bit to maybe gain a better understanding of even how the legal system works. You guys are fighting these things in a world that's completely foreign to me. I have, some knowledge, but, not a ton. So it's just interesting to see how this stuff goes through, how it works, and how you have to fight it. So anyway, man, you guys are doing great things. Keep fighting the good fight. Appreciate everything you guys are doing. Great organization doing positive things. So definitely encourage anybody out there who's interested in preserving and defending the Second Amendment to consider the Second Amendment Foundation to provide some support there. So, but Adam, man, can't thank you enough. This was super informative.
Yeah, good. Glad, happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Awesome, man. Well, like I said, keep fighting the good fight. We appreciate it. And until next time, everybody, happy hunting and shooting. We'll catch you on the next one.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.